the spring of 1972, in Buchanan County, Iowa, every farmer was plowing. Every farmer except one. Her name was Adelaide Crowfield. Most folks called her Della. She was 63 years old, a widow of 3 years, and she stood alone on the porch of a wooden farmhouse, watching her neighbors turn their fields the way men had turned fields for 10,000 years. She would not be joining them. The men at the co-op coffee counter had a name for her now. The crazy widow. The John Deere dealer, her dead husband's best friend, had stopped tipping his hat when she walked past. Her own daughter had driven 300 miles from Minneapolis just to slam a fist on the kitchen table and shout, "Mama, you'll lose everything Daddy built." But Della had a secret. A book she found at a church rummage sale for 50 cents. A book with another farmer's name written inside the front cover, dated 1944, and tucked between 2 yellowed pages, a letter. A letter written by her own husband, Henrik, 12 days before he dropped dead in the South Field. A letter she was never supposed to read. What that letter said would unravel 3 decades of marriage. What it asked her to do would set her against the entire county. And what she would discover 4 years later, in the worst drought Iowa had seen in a generation, would change everything. This is the story of a woman who waited until 63 to find her courage, and the dead husband who finally, through a 50-cent book, gave her permission to use it. This is the story of the woman who listened to the soil, and the soil that listened back. The first thing you need to know about Adelaide Crowfield is that she was not the kind of woman who cried easily. She had cried twice in her life. Once when her mother died in 1947, once when Henrik dropped dead in the South Field on a Thursday morning in March of 1969. That was it. 2 cries. 63 years. Some women keep tally of their kisses. Della kept tally of her tears. So when she found the letter tucked inside the 50-cent book in January of 1972, and she sat at her kitchen table reading it 3 times in a row, and she felt her chest start doing something funny, she told herself she was not going to cry. She told herself this firmly. She told herself this out loud. And then she cried for 4 hours. The farmhouse sat on a slow rise off County Road 218, surrounded on all sides by 280 acres of black Iowa dirt. Henrik's grandfather had bought the land in 1894 for $2 an acre. Henrik's father had added the eastern quarter section in 1923. Henrik had paid off the last mortgage in 1961. 3 generations of Crowfield men had worked this ground. And then there was Della, the woman who married into the name, the woman who was supposed to bake the pies and raise the daughters and stand in the kitchen window watching her husband disappear into the fields each spring. The woman who was not supposed to be running the place alone at 63. But here she was, 3 years a widow, 2 daughters grown and gone, 1 farm, 280 acres, and a body that ached every morning before her feet hit the cold pine floor. She did the work anyway, because what else was there? Henrik had been a quiet man, not cold, not distant, just quiet. He kept his thoughts in his chest the way some men keep coins in a jar. You knew they were in there. You just didn't get to count them. He was 41 years old when he married her in 1929. She was 20. She had been studying biology at the State University, 2 years finished, 2 years to go, when her father got sick and the money ran dry and Henrik came around in his Sunday suit asking for her hand the way a man asks to borrow a horse. She said yes. She told herself it was because she loved him. Maybe she did. Maybe she just loved the idea of having somewhere to put her hands. For 39 years they had farmed together. He plowed. She kept the books. He fixed the fence. She fixed the dinner. He went to the co-op on Saturday mornings. She went to church on Sundays. They had 2 daughters. They lost 1 son to a stillbirth in 1936. They never spoke of the boy after the burial. Henrik dug the small grave himself, under the oak tree at the edge of the south field, and he did not say a single word for 3 days afterward. Della understood. That was their marriage. 2 people. 1 silence. Some things you don't need words for. And then, in March of 1969, on a Thursday morning that started like any other Thursday morning, Henrik kissed her on the forehead and walked out to start the tractor. And 45 minutes later, she found him face down in a fresh furrow, with the engine still running, and his right hand buried in the dirt up to the wrist. The doctor said it was his heart. Della knew that already. She had felt hers stop too. For 3 years, she ran the farm alone. She hired Wendell Stack to plow each spring. $800 he charged her, which was robbery, and they both knew it. But Wendell had a wife with cancer, and Della had nobody to share the bed with anymore, so the $800 felt like a fair trade for not having to ask twice. She drove the combine in October. She wrote the checks. She fixed the leaky pipe in the milk house with her own 2 hands the night the temperature dropped to 7 below, and the whole barn might have flooded if she'd waited until morning. She did not complain. She did not ask for help. She did not tell her daughters how badly her back hurt at the end of each day. Some pain you keep for yourself. Otherwise, people start looking at you sideways. They start using that word, mama, the way they used to say it when you were strong. Now they say it like you're a glass of water on the edge of a table. Della would not be a glass of water. Della would be the table. Her oldest daughter was Coralie. Coralie called every Sunday at 6 o'clock from Minneapolis. She was a nurse, 38 years old, 2 kids of her own, married to a man named Donald, who sold insurance and laughed too loud at his own jokes. The Sunday calls always went the same way. Mama, how are you? I'm fine, sweetheart. Mama, you don't have to do this alone. I'm fine, sweetheart. Mama, Donald and I have been talking and I'm fine, sweetheart. Della would say I'm fine until Coralie ran out of breath. Then they would talk about the grandchildren. Then they would hang up. Then Della would sit at the kitchen table and look at the empty chair across from her, Henrik's chair, and she would say nothing at all for a long time. Her younger daughter was Margaret, but everyone called her Winnie, always had. Even her own mother forgot sometimes that Winnie's full name was Margaret. Winnie was easier than Coralie, 34 years old, a school teacher in Cedar Rapids, single, no children, never married, and Della had stopped asking why. Winnie called on Wednesdays. Winnie understood silence. It was Winnie who first said, "The September after Henrik died. Mama, you should read more this winter. You used to read." Della had laughed. "Read what?" "Anything," Winnie had said. "Just anything that isn't the seed catalog." Della had not laughed for long after that, because she realized her daughter was right. She had not opened a book in 15 years, which is how, on a cold Saturday in January of 1972, Adelaide Crowfield found herself in the basement of the Buchanan County Public Library, browsing the dollar table at the parish rummage sale next door. She was looking for something to read. She did not know what. She did not particularly care. She picked up a romance novel, set it down, picked up a cookbook, set it down, picked up a Reader's Digest condensed volume, and almost laughed out loud because Henrik had hated those things. "Takes the meat out of a book and leaves you the gristle," he used to say. And then she saw the box, a cardboard box on the floor, half tucked under the table. Someone had written on the side, in black marker. Misc, agriculture. 50 cents. Della crouched down. Her knees popped. She dug through the box. Soil testing pamphlets from 1958, a John Deere parts catalog, a USDA bulletin on hog pricing, and underneath all of it, a book, hardcover, brown, the dust jacket gone, the corners soft with water damage, the spine cracked in 3 places. She turned it over. Plowman's Folly, by Edward H. Faulkner, published 1943. She had never heard of it. She opened the front cover, and there, in faded blue ink, in the careful handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship before the war, property of Earl Haberman, 1944. Della knew that name. Earl Haberman had been a farmer over by Aurelia. He had died in 1958 of a stroke in his own barn. His widow had moved to Sioux City, and his books had ended up here, in a cardboard box in the basement of a library 14 years later. Della felt something move inside her chest. She didn't know what it was. She wouldn't know what it was for another hour. She paid her 2 quarters to the woman at the table. She walked home through the cold. She made tea. She sat down at the kitchen table, Henrik's chair empty across from her, as always, and she opened the book to the first chapter. The first sentence read, "No one has ever advanced a scientific reason for plowing." Della read it again, and then again, and then a 4th time. She set the book down on the table. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at the book. Then she went and got her reading glasses from the bedroom, and she came back and she read the entire opening chapter without moving once. When she finished, the tea was cold. The kitchen was dark, and Adelaide Crowfield, 63 years old, widow of 3 years, mother of 2, owner of 280 acres of black Iowa dirt, sat very still in her chair and tried to understand what had just happened to her. Because she had spent 30 years married to a man who plowed every spring without fail, and a man dead 14 years had just told her from the grave that her husband had been wrong. She read the book in 2 evenings. She read it again the 3rd evening. On the 4th evening, she went to bed early and could not sleep. On the 5th evening, she opened the book to make a note in the margin, and a folded piece of paper fell out. It had been wedged deep into the binding between pages 84 and 85, where she had not turned before. It looked like it had been there for years. Della picked it up. It was cream-colored, folded in thirds. She unfolded it. Her own kitchen, her own table, her own hands holding the paper. And on the paper, in handwriting, she would know in any room, in any country, at any hour of the night. Della, my love. She stopped breathing. The handwriting was Henrik's. Della, my love. I have read this book 3 times now. I bought it last summer at the seed store in Aurelia. I have hidden it from you because I am ashamed. She sat down. She had to sit down. She was already sitting down. She sat down harder. I think we have been wrong, Della. I think we have been wrong for 30 years. The man who wrote this book is right. There is no good reason to plow. The plow is killing the ground. I have known this in my heart for a long time, but I was afraid. The kitchen clock ticked once. I was afraid Raymond would laugh. I was afraid the men at the co-op would laugh. I was afraid you would be ashamed of me. I was afraid that if I stopped plowing, our daughters would lose their inheritance. Tick. I am writing this letter on March the 6th. The ground will be ready in 2 weeks. I have decided that this spring I will not plow. I will tell you on the morning I do it, and not before. Because if I tell you before, I will lose my courage. I have already lost it once this winter. Tick. If something happens to me, Della, if I do not get the chance to tell you, and if you find this letter, please, be braver than I was. Listen to the ground. The ground knows. The ground has been trying to tell us for 30 years, and we have been too loud to hear it. Tick. I love you more than the work of my hands. Henrik. 12 days. That was the number Della kept coming back to. 12 days between the date on the letter and the morning Henrik dropped dead in the south field. 12 days he had carried this in his chest. 12 days he had eaten dinner across from her with this letter tucked in a book in his sock drawer. 12 days he had kissed her good night and turned out the light and held this secret in the dark next to her. He had been about to tell her. He had been about to tell her. And his heart had stopped before the words could come out. She cried. She had not been planning to cry. She had been planning to be sensible. She had been planning to put the letter down and go make supper. She did not. She cried so hard the dog came in from the porch and put his head on her knee. She cried so hard her glasses fogged up. She cried so hard she had to take them off and set them on the table and press the heels of both hands against her eyes until she saw colors. Because Henrik had been afraid. Henrik, who had carried 200-pound seed sacks on each shoulder. Henrik, who had stared down a tornado in 1953 and refused to leave the porch. Henrik, who had buried their stillborn son with his own 2 hands and not asked anyone to help. Henrik had been afraid of Raymond, of the men at the co-op coffee counter, of her, afraid she would be ashamed of him, of her. Della cried harder because she would never have been ashamed of him, not for a thing like this, not for anything, and he had not known. He had lived his whole life beside her, and he had not known that, which meant. She had not told him. She had not told him often enough that she would have followed him anywhere. That was the cry. That was the 4-hour cry. That was the tear count that broke 35 years of careful arithmetic. When she stopped, the kitchen was dark, and the dog had gone back outside, and her tea was a cold ring at the bottom of the cup. She wiped her face with a dish towel. She picked up the letter. She read it one more time. Then she folded it carefully along the original creases, slid it back into the book, and placed the book on her bedside table next to the Bible. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay on her back in the dark, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about Henrik, and she thought about the ground, and she thought about a man named Earl Haberman who had died of a stroke in 1958 and whose name was in a book in her bedroom. And just before the sun came up, she said, out loud to no one, "Henrik, I'm going to do it." The dog barked once on the porch. Della took it as agreement. She spent the next 2 months in the basement of the Buchanan County Library. Helen Schoening was the librarian, 61 years old, widowed herself, 10 years now. She had ordered every agricultural extension bulletin that crossed her desk for 3 decades because nobody told her not to, and because she liked the way they lined up on the shelf. When Della asked for everything the library had on tillage, Helen looked at her over the top of her glasses and said, "Adelaide Crowfield, what are you up to?" Della said, "I'm reading." Helen said, "I can see that. I'm asking what you're reading toward." Della said, "I'll tell you when I figure it out." Helen said, "Fair enough." And she walked over to the back shelf and pulled down a stack of bulletins 3 feet high. For 8 Saturdays, Della sat at the long oak table in the back of the library, and she read. She read the University of Iowa Extension Bulletin from 1968 on conservation tillage. She read the Ohio State Report on no-till corn trials going back to 1962. She read a USDA soil biology handbook that described in clinical detail what a moldboard plow does to earthworm populations. Reduction of 60 to 90% in a single pass. 60 to 90% in one pass. Della had stared at that number for a long time. She read about a farmer down in Kentucky, a man named Harlan Pickett, who had been planting no-till corn since 1962. 10 years of no-till. Organic matter up by a full percentage point. Water infiltration doubled. Yields matching or exceeding his neighbors who plowed. She read until her eyes hurt and her back ached and her hands cramped from writing. She filled 46 pages of a spiral notebook with numbers and references and questions. And every Saturday, when she walked out of the library into the cold afternoon, she felt something she had not felt since before Henrik died. She felt young, not in her body. Her body was 63 and tired, but behind her eyes, behind her ribs, in whatever place the soul lives. She felt 20 again. She felt like a girl in a biology classroom at the State University, taking notes on phyla and kingdoms, with her whole life ahead of her. She had forgotten what that felt like. She had forgotten she was allowed to feel it. On the last Saturday in February, she closed her notebook for the final time. She knew enough. She knew what the science said. She knew what the soil wanted. She knew what Henrik had wanted. And she knew what she was going to do about it. She told Winnie first. Winnie drove up from Cedar Rapids on the first Sunday in March. They sat at the kitchen table. Della made coffee. Winnie waited. Della said, "I'm not going to plow this year." Winnie did not say anything for a long moment. Then Winnie said, "Mama, are you serious?" Della said, "Yes." Winnie said, "Why?" Della said, "Because the ground is dying, and your father knew it, and I'm going to do something about it." Winnie set her coffee cup down. Winnie said, "Mama, Daddy plowed every year for 40 years. Della said, "I know." Winnie said, "And you think you know better than him?" Della said, "No, I think he knew better than him." Winnie tilted her head. Della reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out the letter. She set it on the table between them. Winnie picked it up. Winnie unfolded it. Winnie read. Winnie's hands started shaking around page 2. When she finished, she did not say anything for a very long time. Then she said, very softly, "Mama, have you shown this to Coralie?" Della said, "No." Winnie said, "You have to." Della said, "I will, when the time is right." Winnie said, "When is the time right?" Della said, "When I've already started, when she can't talk me out of it." Winnie folded the letter carefully, slid it back across the table. Winnie said, "Mama, she's going to lose her mind." Della said, "Yes." Winnie said, "And you're going to do it anyway." Della said, "Yes." Winnie sat back in her chair. Winnie smiled, small, sad, proud, all at once. Winnie said, "Daddy would have been so afraid for you." Della said, "I know." Winnie said, "But he would have been so proud." That was the third cry. 3 cries, 63 years. Della was running out of arithmetic. Coralie found out 4 weeks later, on a Saturday in early April, when she happened to drive past the farm on her way to a conference in Des Moines. She slammed on the brakes so hard she almost rear-ended a pickup truck. She turned around. She drove up the long gravel driveway. She got out of the car. She stood at the edge of the south field, and she stared, because the field was still covered in last year's corn stalks, because the ground had not been turned. because it was the second week of April and every other field in Buchanan County was a smooth black ocean of fresh turned earth, and her mother's field looked like a junkyard. She walked into the kitchen without knocking. She found Della at the sink, washing breakfast dishes. She said, and her voice was pitched high and tight and trembling, "Mama, what is going on?" Della did not turn around. Della said, "Hello, Coralie. Would you like coffee?" Coralie said, "Mama, the fields." Della said, "I'm not plowing this year." Coralie made a sound in her throat that was not quite a word. Della rinsed a plate. Coralie said, "Mama, look at me." Della turned around. She dried her hands on her apron. She looked at her daughter. Coralie looked at her mother. There was a long moment where neither of them spoke. Then Coralie said, "You've lost your mind." Della said, "No, sweetheart. I found it." Coralie said, "Mama, you can't do this. Daddy would never." Della said, "Don't." Coralie stopped. Della had said it like a knife. Della had never spoken to her daughter like that. Coralie said, "Mama." Della said, "Don't tell me what your father would have wanted. You don't know." Coralie said, "I know he plowed every spring of his life." Della said, "That doesn't mean he wanted to." Coralie's mouth opened. Coralie's mouth closed. Coralie said, "What does that mean?" Della said, "Sit down, sweetheart." Coralie sat. Della made coffee. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table for 45 minutes, and Della told her oldest daughter about the 50-cent book and the Saturday afternoons in the library and the soil organisms and the earthworms and the science. She did not show her the letter. Not yet. She would show her the letter later, when the time was right, when Coralie had spent enough time being angry to have a little space left for understanding. Coralie listened. Coralie's face did not change. When Della finished, Coralie said, "Mama, I'm going to call Donald. We're going to find a buyer for the farm." Della said, "No." Coralie said, "Mama, you're 63. Della said, "I know how old I am." Coralie said, "You can't run a farm based on a book you found in a library." Della said, "I've been running it for 3 years already." Coralie said, "Yes, and look at you." Della said, "Look at me what?" Coralie said, "You're tired, Mama. You're worn out." Della said, "Coralie, listen to me." Coralie listened. Della said, "I am tired. I am worn out. I am 63 years old, and my back hurts every morning, and I miss your father every minute of every day. All of that is true." Della leaned forward. Della said, "And I am going to do this thing anyway, with or without you." Coralie stood up. Coralie said, "Then it's going to be without me." Coralie walked out. Coralie got in her car. Coralie drove to Des Moines and then back to Minneapolis, and she did not call her mother for 3 months. The Saturday after Coralie left, Della went to the co-op. She did this every other Saturday. Buy seed, pay the bill, pick up parts. It was routine. She had been doing it for 40 years. But this Saturday was different. Because by Saturday, every man in Buchanan County had driven past her place at least twice. And every man in Buchanan County had noticed the same thing. The Crowfield place was not plowed. She walked into the co-op at 9 in the morning. The bell over the door chimed. The room went quiet. 5 men at the coffee counter, Raymond Lindquist, Harlan Voss, Bud Skagg, Jimmy Petrie, and the co-op manager, a man named Cliff. They all looked at her. Della walked to the counter. She set down her shopping list. She said, "Morning, Cliff." Cliff said, "Morning, Della." Cliff did not say anything else. The men at the coffee counter were watching her. She could feel it, the way you can feel a hot stove without touching it. Cliff started filling her order. Raymond Lindquist cleared his throat. Raymond was 56 years old. He was the John Deere dealer in Geneva. He had been Henrik's best friend for 30 years. He had given the eulogy at Henrik's funeral. He had cried, actually cried, the only time Della had ever seen him do it, at the cemetery, with one big hand on Henrik's coffin. Raymond said, "Adelaide." He never called her Adelaide. He called her Della, like everyone else. Della turned. Raymond said, "I drove past your place yesterday." Della said, "Did you?" Raymond said, "I did." Raymond said, "Adelaide, sweetheart, are you all right?" Della said, "I'm fine, Raymond." Raymond said, "Because your fields aren't turned." Della said, "I know." Raymond said, "It's the second week of April." Della said, "I know." Raymond said, "Honey, you got somebody to come do it for you. Wendell's still around. I can call him this afternoon. We can have your fields turned by Wednesday." Della said, "Raymond." Raymond stopped. Della said, "I'm not plowing this year." The co-op went absolutely silent. You could have heard a fly land on a piece of bread. Raymond said, "I'm sorry." "What?" Della said, "I'm not plowing. Not this year. Not next year. Not ever again." Raymond's coffee cup made a small sound on the counter as he set it down. Raymond said, "Adelaide." Della said, "Don't." Raymond said, "Adelaide, sweetheart." Della said, "Raymond, I am not your sweetheart." The men at the counter went very still. Raymond's face went red. Raymond said, "Della, you can't be serious." Della said, "I'm serious." Raymond said, "You can't farm without plowing. Nobody farms without plowing." Della said, "Somebody does. A man named Harlan Pickett in Kentucky has been doing it for 10 years. Raymond said, "Kentucky." He said it the way another man might say Mars. Della said, "Yes, Kentucky." Raymond said, "Della, Henrik would not want you to do this." And there it was. The thing he should not have said. The thing he had no right to say. Della felt something get very still inside her chest. Very still. Very cold. The way water gets just before it freezes. Della said, "Raymond." Raymond said, "Honey, I'm just saying." "Henrik." Della said, "Raymond, you don't know what Henrik wanted." Raymond said, "Adelaide, I knew that man for 30 years. Della said, "And I was married to him for 40. Raymond opened his mouth. Raymond closed his mouth. Della picked up her bag of seed. She paid Cliff in cash. She walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. She turned around. She looked at Raymond Lindquist, best friend of her dead husband, John Deere dealer, 56 years old, his coffee going cold in front of him. And she said, "Raymond, Henrik was afraid of you." Raymond's face went white. Della said, "He told me so, in a letter, before he died." She did not say more. She did not need to. She walked out of the co-op. The bell chimed once behind her. The room stayed silent for a long time after she was gone. She drove home with her hands trembling on the wheel. She did not cry. She had cried enough this winter. She drove home and she put the seed in the barn and she made herself a cup of tea. And she sat at the kitchen table and she waited for whatever was going to happen next. Because she knew something was going to happen. You cannot say a thing like that, "Henrik was afraid of you," to a man like Raymond Lindquist in a room full of farmers in a town the size of Geneva, Iowa, and have nothing happen next. She was right. Something happened next. It happened that very night. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Della was washing her face in the bathroom mirror. The dog barked. She heard a car in the driveway. She walked to the front window. She pulled the curtain aside. A green Buick was parked next to her pickup truck. A woman was getting out. A woman in a wool coat. A woman with silver hair pinned up in a bun. A woman holding a tin of cookies in one hand and a leather-bound notebook in the other. Della knew her. Della had known her for 30 years. Beatrice Lindquist, Raymond's wife, 60 years old. The most polite, well-bred, quiet woman Adelaide Crowfield had ever met in her life. And here she was at 9 o'clock at night, on a Saturday in April, walking up Della's porch steps with her face set like a woman who had finally decided to do something about something. Della opened the door before Beatrice could knock. The two women stood looking at each other in the porch light. Beatrice said, "Adelaide." Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "I heard what you said to Raymond at the co-op this morning." Della said, "I figured you would have." Beatrice said, "May I come in?" Della stepped aside. Beatrice walked in. Beatrice set the cookies on the kitchen table. Beatrice set the notebook on the kitchen table. Beatrice took off her coat. Beatrice sat down in Henrik's chair. Della sat down across from her. Beatrice opened the notebook. The pages were yellow with age. The handwriting was not Beatrice's. It was a man's handwriting, tight, precise, written in pencil that had faded to soft gray. Beatrice slid the notebook across the table. Beatrice said, "Adelaide, this belonged to my father." Della looked down. The first page was dated April 3rd, 1939. Beatrice said, "In 1939, my father became the first farmer in Buchanan County to try not plowing his fields." Della looked up. Beatrice's eyes were wet. Beatrice said, "And what I'm about to tell you, Adelaide, no one in this county has heard for 33 years, not even Raymond." The wind picked up outside. The dog barked once on the porch. The kitchen clock ticked. And Adelaide Crowfield, 63 years old, widow of 3 years, mother of 2, the woman who would not plow, leaned forward across the table and listened. Because she understood, in that moment, that she was not the first. She was only the next. And whatever this woman was about to tell her was going to change everything. Beatrice Lindquist was 60 years old. She had been Raymond's wife for 38 of those years. She had raised 3 sons. She had buried both her parents. She had served on the Lutheran Church Altar Guild since 1956. She had baked the same pumpkin bread recipe every November for 40 Novembers. And in all that time, 3 sons, 2 parents, 4 decades of pumpkin bread, Beatrice Lindquist had never told another living soul what she was about to tell Adelaide Crowfield. She kept her hands folded on top of her father's notebook. She looked across the table. She said, "My maiden name was Beatrice Halvorsen." Della nodded. She had known that. Beatrice said, "My father was Sven Halvorsen. He came from Norway in 1908. He bought a quarter section north of Aurelia in 1922. He was a smart man, Adelaide. He read 3 languages. He read journals from Europe. He read agricultural science papers nobody else in this county had ever heard of." Della waited. Beatrice said, "In the spring of 1939, my father did not plow his fields." Della said, Beatrice said, "He had read a paper out of Germany, about what tillage does to soil structure. He believed it." Della said, Beatrice said, "He stood out on his front porch on the first Sunday of April, 1939, and he watched every other farmer in the township turn their fields, and he did not turn his. Della said, "Beatrice, wait." She did not know why she was saying, "Wait." She was saying wait because something inside her was already starting to understand what came next, and she did not want to hear it. Not yet. Beatrice did not wait. Beatrice said, "He lasted 4 months." Della closed her eyes. Beatrice said, "By August, the rumors had started. He had gone soft. He had gone strange. He was reading too many books. He was talking to himself in the fields. He was," and this is the word they used. Adelaide, this is the word. Beatrice's voice cracked. "Touched." Della opened her eyes. Beatrice said, "They told the bank he was touched." Della said, "Who?" Beatrice said, "Men in this county. Men whose names I will not say at this kitchen table because I have never said them out loud." Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "The bank called my father's loan in October of 1939. My father could not pay. The bank sold the farm at auction in November." Beatrice's hands tightened on the notebook. Beatrice said, "The man who bought the farm at half what it was worth was Knut Lindquist." Della went still. Beatrice said, "Raymond's father." The kitchen clock ticked. Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "My father moved us to a rented house in town. He could not find work. No one would hire him." The story had spread. "That Halvorsen, he's not right in the head." My mother took in laundry. My brothers and I shared a bed. Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "My father caught pneumonia in the winter of 1941. He could not afford the doctor. By the time they took him to the hospital, it was too late." Beatrice's eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She had cried this cry already, a long time ago, by herself. Beatrice said, "My father died on February 9th, 1941. He was 47 years old. He was the smartest man I ever knew. And he died because he tried to do what you are doing right now, Adelaide. And the men in this county would not let him." Della reached across the table. She put her hand over Beatrice's hand. Neither of them said anything for a very long time. The clock ticked 17 times. Della counted. She did not know why she was counting. The mind does strange things when it cannot do what it wants to do, which is scream. Finally, Della said, "How did you marry his son?" Beatrice almost laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had asked herself that question so many times the answer had worn smooth in her mouth. Beatrice said, "I was 22. He was 28. He was handsome. He had money. My mother was sick. There was no other way out." Della nodded. She understood. She had been 20 when she married Henrik. Sometimes a woman marries the way a person grabs a rope in a flood. You don't ask where the rope came from. You hold on. Beatrice said, "Knut Lindquist was dead by the time I married Raymond. Heart attack in 1949. I told myself it was over. I told myself I could be a Lindquist now and the past would let me alone." Della said, "And it didn't." Beatrice said, "No, it didn't." Beatrice slid the notebook across the table. Beatrice said, "I have kept this for 33 years. I have not shown it to anyone. Not Raymond. Not my sons. No one." Beatrice said, "When I heard what you told Raymond this morning at the co-op, I went home and I sat on the bed and I thought about it for 9 hours. And then I came over here." Della said, "Why?" Beatrice said, "Because my father was right, Adelaide. He was right, and they killed him for it. And every spring for 33 years, I have watched the men in this county turn that ground, and I have heard my father's voice in my head saying, 'They are killing it.' And I have said nothing." Beatrice's voice broke. Beatrice said, "I am 60 years old. I do not have many springs left. I would like to see one woman in this county prove my father right before I die. Della felt the tears coming, and she did not stop them. She said, Beatrice, I will try. Beatrice said, I know you will. Beatrice stood up. Beatrice put on her coat. Beatrice said, I will not come to your farm again. Raymond would notice. But you may call me on the telephone any time you need to. I have an extension in the sewing room. He never goes in there. Beatrice walked to the door. At the door, Beatrice turned. Beatrice said, Adelaide. Della said, yes. Beatrice said, don't quit. Promise me you will not quit. Della said, I promise. Beatrice said, even when it gets bad, and it will get bad. Della said, I promise. Beatrice nodded once. Beatrice walked out into the cold. The Buick started. The headlights swept across the kitchen window. The Buick drove away. Della sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, with her hand still on the notebook, and she understood for the first time in her life what a marriage of 40 years had not taught her. That the women in this county had been carrying the men's secrets for generations, and that nobody had ever asked them to set those secrets down. The first year was bad in a way Della had not prepared for. She had prepared for the work. She had prepared for the looks at the co-op. She had prepared for Coralie's silence, which arrived on schedule and lasted, as promised, 3 full months. What she had not prepared for was the loneliness, because in April she planted her corn into the unbroken stubble of last year's stalks. She had borrowed a planter modified with coulter blades from a farmer down in Mahaska County who had been experimenting with no-till himself. She drove that planter across her 280 acres alone in 3 days, with the stubble of the previous year still standing all around her like a brown beard, and every other field in Buchanan County was black, smooth, clean, turned, beautiful. Hers was not. Hers looked like a field a man had walked away from in disgust. She knew it. She drove past it twice a day. She saw it through her own eyes and through her neighbor's eyes, both at once. In May, the corn came up. It came up unevenly. The rows were thinner than they should have been. The stalks were paler than the neighbor's stalks. The weeds came up too, fast and thick and stubborn, because the herbicides she could afford could not kill what the plow would have buried. She walked her fields every morning. She knelt in the dirt. She lifted handfuls of soil and let it run through her fingers. The soil was wrong. She knew it was wrong. It was compacted from 30 years of plowing. The plow pan was still down there, 6 inches deep, like a concrete floor under her feet. The earthworms were not back yet. The fungal networks had been severed for so long they did not know how to reach each other. The biology of the ground was a city after a war. Buildings standing, but no people in them yet. Della had read about this. She had known it would be like this. She had not known how it would feel, like walking into a house and finding all the rooms empty, like calling a name and hearing nothing answer. In June, the heat came. The corn struggled. Her neighbor's corn, planted in beautiful black-turned earth, was 8 inches taller than hers by the end of the month. She watched the cars slow down on County Road 218. She watched the men point. She watched them shake their heads. She did not stop. In July, Coralie called. Della picked up the phone on the second ring. Coralie said, "Mama." Della said, "Hello, sweetheart." There was a long pause. Coralie said, "I drove past the farm last weekend." Della said, "Did you?" Coralie said, "Mama, the corn looks bad." Della said, "I know what it looks like, Coralie." Coralie said, "Mama, please, Let Donald and me find a buyer. You can come live with us. The kids would love, Della said. Coralie, I have to go. The dog needs feeding. Della hung up. She sat at the kitchen table. The dog had been fed an hour ago. She looked out the window at her ugly, thin, pale corn. She did not cry. She had decided, somewhere around the second week of June, that she was not going to cry about this anymore. Tears were a tax she could not afford to pay. The yield in October of 1972 was 76 bushels per acre. The county average was 88, 12 bushels short. On 280 acres, at $1.30 per bushel, she lost $4,368. Real money, on paper, visible in the books. She had savings. She had a little. Henrik had been a careful man. There was a bank account he had built up over 40 years that had something in it for an emergency. She used some of it that fall. Not much, but some. She told herself she could do this for 2 more years, 3 at the absolute outside. After that, she did not let herself finish the thought. In late October, after the harvest, on a cold afternoon when the wind was cutting hard out of the northwest, Della went out to the barn to clean. The barn had not been properly cleaned in 3 years. Henrik had kept it tidy. After Henrik died, Della had kept the house and let the barn slide. There was only so much one woman could do, and the cows had been sold the spring after the funeral, and the barn was a place she did not need to go very often. But the wind had blown a piece of tin loose on the south side, and Della had to climb up there to nail it down, and as long as she was in the barn, she figured she might as well take a look at the loft. She climbed the ladder. Her knees popped. The loft was full of 40 years of accumulated stuff. Old harness, broken pitchforks, a crate of mason jars, a box of children's books that had belonged to the girls. And in the back corner, under a tarp she did not remember covering with a tarp, a wooden trunk, cedar, locked. Della stared at it. She did not remember the trunk. She had cleaned this loft in 1962. She would have remembered a locked cedar trunk, which meant Henrik had brought it up here after that, which meant Henrik had brought it up here in secret. She went back to the house. She got the ring of keys from Henrik's dresser drawer, the keys she had not been able to bring herself to throw away, and she carried them out to the barn, and she climbed back up to the loft. The third key fit. The lock clicked. The lid creaked open. Della knelt on the dusty boards. She looked inside, and her heart stopped for the second time in her life. Books, 32 of them, stacked in neat rows, the way Henrik stacked everything. She picked up the one on top, Soil Microbiology and Biochemistry, published 1959. She picked up the next one, The Living Soil, by Lady Eve Balfour, published 1943. She picked up the next one, Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture, by J. Russell Smith. Della sat back on her heels. Her husband, her quiet, plain, plow every spring, silent at the supper table husband, had been hiding a library in the loft of his own barn. For years, she kept digging. There were soil testing kits. There were extension bulletins from 6 different states. There were maps of their farm, with 5 acres in the back, marked off in red pencil and labeled No Plow, 1965. And underneath everything, a leather notebook, bound with a strap. She pulled it out. She opened it. And there, on the first page, in Henrik's careful, tight pencil handwriting, Henrik Crowfield, Personal Notes, begin March 1965. Della carried the notebook back to the house. She carried it the way you carry a baby. She set it on the kitchen table. She made tea. She sat down. She opened to the first page, and she read her husband for the first time in their lives. The notebook was about the back 5 acres. Henrik had decided in the spring of 1965, 4 years before he died, that he was going to run an experiment. He had picked 5 acres at the very back of the farm where the road did not go past, where Raymond Lindquist would never drive by, where no one but Henrik himself would ever see what was happening. And he had not plowed those 5 acres. For 4 years, he had recorded everything, every measurement, every observation, every yield. He had written it in his cramped, careful hand, in pencil with diagrams. The first year, 1965, the back 5 acres had yielded 12 bushels less per acre than the rest of the farm. The second year, 1966, the gap had closed to 7 bushels. The third year, 1967, the back 5 acres had matched the rest of the farm exactly. The fourth year, 1968, the back 5 acres had out-yielded the rest of the farm by 18%. 18%. Della put her hand over her mouth. Henrik had known. Henrik had proven it. On their own land, with his own hands, for 4 years. And he had never told her. She kept reading. The entries got more detailed. Henrik had started measuring earthworms. He had started measuring soil moisture. He had drawn pictures, small, clumsy pencil sketches of fungal threads under a magnifying glass. By 1968, the entries had started to turn. March 12th, 1968. Della asked me at supper why I was so quiet lately. I could not tell her. I do not know how to begin. April 3rd, 1968. The back 5 out-yielded the south 40 by 21 bushels last fall. Raymond would call me a fool if he knew. Della would understand. I think Della would understand. But I am afraid to find out. June 19th, 1968. I almost told her tonight. We were sitting on the porch. The fireflies were out. She had her hand on my arm. I almost told her. I did not. October 11th, 1968. The harvest is in. The back 5 did it again. I am too old to be afraid like this, and yet I am. And then, on a page near the end of the notebook, the last entry. Dated March 9th, 1969. 12 days before Henrik died in the South Field. Della was shaking now. She read it. March 9th, 1969. Della does not know what I have been doing. I will tell her this spring when I do not plow. She is smarter than I am. She is braver than I am. If she had been the one who read the book first, she would have done this 5 years ago. I have wasted those 5 years out of cowardice. I will not waste this spring. 40 years from now, when she is gone, and I am gone, and our daughters are gone, I want there to be a piece of land in Iowa that remembers what I should have done. Della will make it remember. I am sure of this. Della will make it remember. Della closed the notebook. She put both hands flat on top of it. She lowered her forehead onto her hands, and she did not cry the way she had cried in January. She cried different. She cried because she finally knew the man she had been married to for 40 years. She had married a stranger, and she had buried a stranger. And tonight, in October of 1972, in her own kitchen, by the light of a single bulb over the table, she was meeting her husband for the first time. He was wonderful. He was wonderful and brilliant and frightened and kind. He had been in there all those years. She had been beside him all those years. And neither one of them had known how to open the door. The dog whined at the back door. Della got up. Her body felt like it weighed nothing. She let the dog in. She gave him a piece of bread. She turned out the kitchen light. She carried the leather notebook to the bedroom, and she set it on the nightstand next to the Bible and the 50-cent book. She lay down on the bed. She did not undress. She stared at the ceiling. She said, very softly, into the dark, "Henrik, I forgive you." The dog, on the rag rug beside the bed, sighed. Della closed her eyes. She slept harder that night than she had slept in 3 years. Coralie came home for Thanksgiving. She did not call ahead. She just drove down from Minneapolis on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving with Donald and the kids. And she walked into the kitchen at 3 in the afternoon, and she said, "Mama, I'm sorry." Della did not say anything. She set down the mixing bowl she was holding. She walked across the kitchen. She put her arms around her oldest daughter. She held on. That Thanksgiving, after the children were in bed and Donald had gone out to the porch to smoke his pipe, Della sat down at the kitchen table with her 2 daughters. She brought out the leather notebook. She brought out the letter. She brought out the 50-cent book. She set all 3 on the table. She said, "I want to tell you both about your father." Coralie and Winnie sat very still. Della told them everything. She told them about the back 5 acres. She told them about the 4-year experiment. She told them about Henrik's fear and Henrik's notes and Henrik's cramped pencil sketches of fungal threads under a magnifying glass. She told them what their father had written about her on the night before he died. Della will make it remember. Coralie cried. Winnie did not cry, but she put her hand over her mother's hand, and she did not move it for a long time. When Della was done, Coralie said, "Mama, why didn't you tell me sooner?" Della said, "Because I needed you to believe in me before you believed in him." Coralie was quiet for a while. Then Coralie said, "Mama, I'm so sorry." Della said, "I know, sweetheart, I know." Coralie said, "I was so afraid." Della said, "I know." Coralie said, "I was afraid of losing you the way we lost Daddy." Della said, "Sweetheart, you're not going to lose me." Coralie said, "You don't know that." Della said, "No, I don't. But I am going to live every day I have left, Coralie. I am going to live them on this land. And when I go, I want you to know I went living, not waiting." Coralie pressed her forehead against her mother's shoulder. She cried like a child. Della held her like a child. Winnie poured herself another cup of coffee and watched the snow start to fall outside the kitchen window, and she smiled. Small, sad, proud, all at once, the way she had smiled the night Della first showed her the letter. The Crowfield kitchen, on Thanksgiving night of 1972, was the warmest room in Buchanan County. Spring came again. Della went to the co-op on the 2nd Saturday in March. She walked in. The bell chimed. The men at the coffee counter went quiet, just like before. She walked to the counter. She set down her order list. She said, "Morning, Cliff." Cliff did not look at her. Cliff said, "Adelaide, I can't fill this order today." Della said, "Excuse me." Cliff said, "You got an outstanding balance with us, $842, from last summer. Can't sell you any more seed until that's settled." Della went still. Della said, "Cliff, I paid that balance. In August. I have the receipt at home." Cliff said, "Records say different." Della said, "Records are wrong." Cliff said, "Records are records." Della stood there for a long moment. She looked at Cliff. Cliff would not meet her eye. She turned around. She looked at the coffee counter. Raymond Lindquist was at the coffee counter, drinking a cup of coffee, looking out the window like the most innocent man in Iowa. Della understood. She understood in 1 second flat. She walked across the room. She walked right up to Raymond. She stood there until he looked at her. When he finally looked at her, she said, "Raymond." Raymond said, "Adelaide." Della said, "Did you tell Cliff to refuse my order?" Raymond said, "Now, Adelaide, that's between you and Cliff." Della said, "Did you tell Cliff to refuse my order?" Raymond said, "I might have mentioned that you were behind on your bill." Della said, "I'm not behind on my bill." Raymond said, "Cliff seems to think you are." Della said, "Raymond, look at me." Raymond looked at her. His face was pale. His eyes were tight. He was a man who had done a small, ugly thing, and he knew it. Della said, "Why?" Raymond did not answer. Della said, "Why, Raymond?" Raymond said, "Adelaide, I was at your daughter's house last week." Della went cold. Raymond said, "I drove up to Minneapolis. I had business up there." Della said, "You don't have business in Minneapolis." Raymond said, "I had business with your daughter. I told her she needed to talk some sense into you before you bankrupt yourself, before you destroy what Henrik built." Della felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. She did not raise them. She had never raised her hands to a man in her life. She was not going to start now, but she was going to say something, and she was going to say it loud enough for every man in the co-op to hear. She said, "Raymond Lindquist." Raymond said, "Adelaide." Della said, "You went to my daughter's house, behind my back, to tell her to override her mother." Raymond said, "I was trying to help." Della said, "No." Della said, "You were trying to win." Raymond opened his mouth. Della said, "You were not trying to help me. You were trying to make sure that a 63-year-old widow does not embarrass you in front of every farmer in this county." The co-op was completely silent. Della said, "You're afraid, Raymond." Raymond said, "Adelaide." Della said, "You're afraid that if I am right, you have spent 34 years selling the wrong tool to the wrong men. You're afraid your father was right behind you the whole time, telling you what to think. You're afraid because you know, somewhere in there, Raymond, you know, that Henrik told you about the back 5 acres, and you laughed at him, didn't you? You laughed at him." Raymond's face went white. He had not been expecting that. He had not known that Della knew. Della had not known either until that exact second. But she saw it now, in his face, in the way his mouth went slack. Henrik had tried to tell him, once, and Raymond had laughed. Della said, "He died ashamed of being your friend." Raymond stood up. The chair scraped. Raymond said, "That is enough." Della said, "No, it is not nearly enough." But she turned around. She walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. She turned. She looked at Cliff. She said, "I'll buy my seed in Mahaska County this year, Cliff, and next year, and every year after that. You can tell Mr. Lindquist where I'm spending my money." She walked out. The bell chimed once. Behind her, in the silent co-op, Raymond Lindquist sat down at the counter very slowly and put his face in his hands. The summer of 1973 was a hard summer, but the corn came in better, 86 bushels per acre. The county average was 89, 3 bushels short, down from 12 the year before. The gap was closing. The earthworms were coming back. She knelt in her fields in July and dug a small hole with her bare hands, and she counted 17 earthworms in 1 square foot of soil. Last year, there had been 4. The year before, when she'd first tested, there had been 3. 17. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, and she laughed out loud. The dog, at the edge of the field, lifted his head and looked at her. Della said, "We're winning, dog." The dog wagged his tail. Della stood up. Her knees popped. She did not care. In December of 1974, Beatrice called. Della picked up the phone on the third ring. Beatrice said, "Adelaide, are you alone in the house?" Della said, "Yes." Beatrice said, "Raymond is in Des Moines tonight, until tomorrow afternoon." Della said, "Beatrice, what is wrong?" Beatrice said, "Adelaide, I lied to you." Della said, "What?" Beatrice said, "In April of 1972, the night I came to your house with my father's notebook." Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "I told you my father caught pneumonia." Della said, "Yes." Beatrice said, "That was true." Della said, "Yes." Beatrice said, "I told you he died because he could not afford the doctor." Della said, "Yes." Beatrice said, "That was also true." Della waited. Beatrice said, "But I did not tell you why he could not afford the doctor." Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "I told you the bank called his loan in 1939. Della said, "Yes." Beatrice said, "I did not tell you who told the bank to call it." Della went still. Beatrice said, "Knut Lindquist, my father-in-law, the man whose name I have carried for 35 years. Beatrice said, "Knut Lindquist went to the bank in October of 1939. He told the bank president, and this is the exact phrase, Adelaide, this is the exact phrase, because my mother heard it from a teller's wife 3 days later, that Halvorsen has gone soft in the head. He's not plowing. He's reading German books. The land won't produce. You'd best call the loan before the harvest comes in and proves him broke." Della closed her eyes. Beatrice said, "The bank called the loan. The harvest had not come in yet. My father had no money. The bank sold the farm. Knut bought it at auction at half price." Beatrice said, "And then, and this is what I did not tell you, Adelaide, and this is what I have not told anyone, ever. Knut went around this county for the next 2 years telling every man who would listen that my father was insane, that he saw things, that he heard voices, that he was a danger to his own children." Beatrice said, "No one would hire my father. No one would lend to my father. No one would even let my father borrow a horse." Beatrice said, "The pneumonia did not kill him, Adelaide." Beatrice said, "The shame killed him." Della did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Beatrice said, "Raymond knows." Della was sitting on the kitchen floor now, with the phone cord stretched across the room and her back against the cabinets, and she did not remember sitting down. Beatrice said, "He has always known." His father told him on his deathbed in 1949. Raymond was 33 years old. He sat by his father's bed, and his father told him what he had done to my father. And Raymond, who had been courting me for almost a year, Raymond did not tell me. Beatrice said, "He proposed to me 5 months later." Beatrice said, "And he never told me." Della pressed the phone harder against her ear. Beatrice said, "I found out from his sister. 2 years into the marriage. His sister got drunk at a Christmas party in 1952. She said she was so sorry about my father, the things her father had done. She had always been so sorry," Beatrice said. "And I went home that night and I asked Raymond, and he said yes. He said yes, he had known. For 4 years he had known and not told me." Beatrice said, "I have lived in that man's house for 35 years, Adelaide. I have raised his sons. I have folded his shirts. I have lain beside him every night, and I have known what he knew." Beatrice was crying now. Della could hear it through the phone. Beatrice said, "And tonight, when I drove past your fields on my way back from town, when I saw your stubble standing through the snow with the corn shocks still up because you don't disc them down the way Knut Lindquist used to. Beatrice said, I knew I could not die without telling someone. Della pressed her free hand over her mouth. Beatrice said, Adelaide, please, don't tell Raymond I called tonight. Della said, I won't. Beatrice said, promise me. Della said, I promise. Beatrice said, promise me on Henrik's grave. Della said, I promise on Henrik's grave. Beatrice was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. The wind moved through the trees outside Della's kitchen window. Beatrice said, Adelaide. Della said, yes. Beatrice said, don't quit. Della said, I won't. Beatrice said, no matter what happens, no matter what they do. Della said, I won't. Beatrice said, my father didn't get to finish. You finish. Della said, I will, Beatrice. I promise. There was a soft click. The line went silent. Della sat on the kitchen floor for an hour after that with the phone in her lap, and she did not move until her legs went numb and the dog came over and put his head on her arm. Spring came again. Della woke up one morning in early March and she walked out to the south field, to the old oak tree where Henrik had died, where she had buried their stillborn son in 1936, where she had buried Henrik's letter in the spring of 1973, because she had decided she could carry it in her chest from now on without holding the paper in her hand. She knelt under the oak. She pressed her palm to the dirt. The dirt was loose. The dirt was alive. The dirt had earthworms in it again, after 36 years of being plowed every spring, after one woman had finally said no. She said, Henrik, the ground is coming back. The wind moved in the branches above her. She said, and I'm not afraid anymore. She stood up. She walked back to the house. She turned on the kitchen radio. The weatherman was talking about the long-range forecast. He said, folks, we are looking at one of the driest summers on record. Long-range models suggest the worst drought conditions Iowa has seen in over a decade may be coming our way this June, July, and August. Farmers, start praying. Della stood in front of the radio. She did not turn it off. She listened to every word. When the forecast ended and the weatherman moved on to the school closings, Della walked across the kitchen and she switched off the radio and she stood at the kitchen window and she looked out at her 280 acres of soft, loose, living dirt. She smiled. A small smile. The kind a woman smiles when she has been waiting a very long time for a thing, and the thing is finally coming. She said, out loud, to nobody, let it come. The drought came in June. It came the way the weatherman said it would. It came the way Della had hoped it would, because she had read enough by then to understand the awful arithmetic of what was about to happen, that her neighbors were going to suffer, and her field was going to prove its point, and there was no version of this story where both of those things were not true at the same time. A woman can hope for vindication. She cannot hope for it without cost. Della knew this. Della made her peace with it. The rain stopped on the 2nd of June. By the 15th, the topsoil on every plowed field in Buchanan County had dried to powder. By the 22nd, the corn was curling its leaves at 9 in the morning. By the end of the month, the temperature had broken 100 degrees 4 times. And Della Crowfield's field stayed green. Not green like a wet year. Not lush. Not tall. Just alive. The corn on her 280 acres stood about a foot shorter than it should have stood. The leaves were a paler green than a good year. The plants were stressed. Anyone could see that. But the plants were standing. The leaves were open. The roots had gone down past the 8-inch plow pan that no longer existed on her ground, because she had not run a plow over that ground in 4 years, and the earthworm tunnels and the fungal threads and the ancient, silent biology of the soil had broken up the hardpan from below the way slow water breaks a stone. Her roots were at 24 inches. Her roots were at 30 inches. Her roots were finding water her neighbor's roots could not reach. Because her neighbor's roots had hit a wall at 8 inches deep, the way roots had hit walls in Buchanan County for 50 years, and the corn on her neighbor's fields was dying from the bottom up, leaf by leaf, in the sun. The cars started slowing on County Road 218 in the second week of July. By the third week, they were stopping. Men got out. They stood at the edge of her field. They looked at her corn. They looked at their own corn across the road. They got back in their trucks. They did not wave at her. She did not wave at them. But she watched. She watched from the kitchen window. She watched from the porch. She watched while she hung wash on the clothesline. She watched the way a woman watches a thing she has been waiting 4 years to see. Ray Donovan farmed the quarter section east of her place. Ray was 52. Decent man, not a friend, not an enemy. The kind of neighbor who waved when he drove past and who had brought a casserole the week Henrik died and then never come back. In the first week of August, Ray's corn fired. That was the word. Fired. Like the plants had caught fire from the bottom up. The leaves turning brown one by one as the corn sacrificed everything below the ear to try to fill the ear, and the ear failing to fill anyway, because there was no water down there for the kernels to swell. Ray walked his fields every morning. Della saw him from her kitchen window. He walked the way a man walks at a funeral, slow, heavy, with his hands in his pockets and his head down and his shoulders pulled forward. By the middle of August, Ray Donovan had stopped walking his fields. He was not coming out of the house anymore. His wife came out. His wife hung the wash and gathered the eggs. But Ray did not come out. Della did something then she had not been planning to do. She baked a peach pie, with the peaches she had canned the summer before, when there had been peaches. She wrapped it in a clean dish towel. She walked across the road. She walked up the long gravel driveway to the Donovan house. She knocked on the kitchen door. Ray's wife, Marcy, opened the door. Marcy's face was tired. Della said, "I brought you a pie." Marcy said, "Della, you shouldn't have." Della said, "Yes, I should have." Marcy took the pie. Marcy looked at it. Marcy looked up at Della. Marcy said, "He's not himself." Della said, "I know." Marcy said, "He drove past your place yesterday. He came back and sat at the table for 2 hours and didn't say a word." Della said, "I know." Marcy said, "Della, is it true, what you did?" Della said, "Yes." Marcy said, "And it's working." Della said, "It's working, Marcy." Marcy was quiet for a long moment. Then Marcy said, "Could you come over for coffee sometime? When this is over, when the harvest is in. Could you come tell Ray about it?" Della said, "Yes." Marcy said, "He'd never ask, but I'm asking." Della said, "I'll come." Marcy nodded. Marcy's eyes were wet. Marcy said, "Thank you for the pie, Della." Della said, "You're welcome, Marcy." Della walked back across the road. She did not cry. She had cried enough this decade, but her chest hurt the whole way home because she understood, for the first time, really, fully, in her bones, that being right was not going to be the gift she had thought it was. Being right was going to mean watching her neighbors lose everything. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. In late August, Raymond Lindquist drove past her field. He did this every day. She knew it. She had been counting since June. He drove past in the morning around 7, and again in the afternoon around 4, and sometimes a third time in the evening when the sun was setting and the light hit her green corn just right. But on the morning of August 28th, he did not just drive past. He stopped. He pulled over to the shoulder of County Road 218. He got out of his truck. He climbed over the fence. He walked into Della Crowfield's south field. Della was on the porch when she saw him. She set down her coffee cup. She watched. She did not go out to meet him. She was not going to go out to meet him. She had not been waiting 4 years to meet Raymond Lindquist halfway. He could come the rest of the way alone. Raymond walked into the field. He walked between 2 rows of green corn. He stopped. He stood there for a long time, 20 seconds, 30. Then he bent down. He crouched. He scooped up a handful of dirt with his right hand. The dirt was dark. The dirt was crumbly. The dirt fell through his fingers in soft brown clumps that landed on his work boots. There was an earthworm in the dirt. A live earthworm. In the second week of an August drought, in a field nobody had irrigated, in soil that should have been dust. Raymond stared at the earthworm. The earthworm wriggled. Raymond Lindquist, 56 years old, John Deere dealer, the man who had laughed at Henrik Crowfield more than once, the man whose father had destroyed Sven Halvorsen, sat down in the dirt of Della Crowfield's south field. He sat down, in his work pants, in her dirt, and he put his face in his hands. And he wept. Della watched from the porch. She did not go to him. She did not call out. She watched a man cry in her field, and she felt, strangely, terribly, no satisfaction at all. She only felt tired. She felt very, very tired. She had spent 4 years waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, she only wanted to take a nap. She sat down on the porch swing. She closed her eyes. When she opened them 10 minutes later, Raymond was gone. His truck was gone. The field was empty. Only the green corn and the dark dirt and the earthworms underneath, still doing the work they had been doing for 4 years now without anybody asking them to. The harvest in October of 1976 was a public event. It was not a celebration. Buchanan County was not in a celebrating mood. But the elevator in Geneva posted the yields each evening on the chalkboard out front, the way they did every fall. And every farmer in the county drove past the elevator at least once that week, slowly to read the numbers. Ray Donovan, 11 bushels per acre. Wayne Clute, who had irrigated all summer, 38 bushels per acre. Bud Skagg, 29. Harlan Voss, 23. The county average came out to 53 bushels per acre. A disaster year. The worst year in a decade. And then, near the bottom of the chalkboard, in chalk, Cliff had written with a hand that may or may not have been steady. A. Crowfield, 82 bushels per acre. 82. 29 bushels above the county average. On 280 acres, that was 8,120 bushels of extra corn. At the drought-inflated price of $2.20 per bushel, that was $17,864 more than the average farmer in Buchanan County had earned that year. For not plowing, for listening to a 50-cent book, for being braver than her dead husband, the way the dead husband had asked her to be in a letter she found wedged in a binding 3 years and 10 months earlier. The chalk numbers sat on the chalkboard for a week. Nobody erased them. Even when the next week's numbers came in, Cliff left A. Crowfield. 82 alone in the corner of the board where every farmer who drove past the elevator could see it. It stayed there until November. Then it snowed. and the chalk smeared, and the numbers slowly faded into a soft white blur that anyone in the county could still read if they wanted to, all the way through Christmas. A reporter from the Des Moines Register drove out to the farm in the second week of October. He was young, 26, eager. He had a camera around his neck and a notebook in his hand, and a good firm handshake that Della shook from the other side of her screen door. She did not let him in. She said, "I appreciate you driving out, young man." He said, "Mrs. Crowfield, I'd like to interview you about your yields this year." Della said, "No." He said, "I'm sorry." Della said, "No interview." He said, "Mrs. Crowfield, you'd be helping farmers across the state. Your story is incredible." Della said, "It's not my story." He said, "I'm sorry." Della said, "Don't write about me. Write about the dirt. Write about Edward Faulkner. He wrote a book in 1943 that nobody read. Go write about him." He said, "Mrs. Crowfield." Della said, "And while you're at it, write about Henrik Crowfield. He had this idea before I did. He just didn't get to finish." The reporter looked at his notebook. The reporter looked back up. The reporter said, "Mom, may I just ask one question?" Della said, "One." He said, "Why did you do this?" Della was quiet for a long moment. She looked past him, at her field, at the harvested rows running off toward the horizon, at the brown stubble that would stand all winter and feed the soil all spring. She said, "Because someone had to." He waited. She said, "And because I was already too old to be afraid of looking foolish." She closed the screen door. The reporter got back in his car and drove away. The article came out the following Sunday. It ran on the front page of the agriculture section. It quoted Della exactly twice. "Don't write about me. Write about the dirt and because someone had to," and otherwise was full of agricultural extension data and quotes from a soil scientist at Iowa State who had spent his whole career trying to get farmers to listen to what one widow in Buchanan County had figured out from a 50-cent book. Letters came to the farm for a month. Della answered every one of them by hand. She kept it brief. She always wrote, somewhere in each letter, "Don't be afraid. The ground knows." Raymond Lindquist drove up Della's gravel driveway on the third Saturday in September of 1976. Della was in the kitchen, canning tomatoes. She watched the truck come up the driveway. She set down the lid she was holding. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the porch. Raymond got out of the truck. He stood beside the truck with both hands in his pockets, the way a small boy stands when he has broken something and has come to admit it. He said, "Della, may I come up?" Della said, "Yes." He came up the porch steps. He sat down on the porch swing. She sat down in the rocking chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Raymond reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out an envelope. The envelope was old. The paper had yellowed. The flap was sealed with a piece of tape that had gone brown at the edges. Raymond said, "I wrote this in 1949. Della said, "Raymond." Raymond said, "I wrote it the week after my father died. I wrote it because he told me what he had done on his deathbed, and I sat by his bed and I listened, and I thought I was going to be sick, and I went home, and I wrote this letter, and I sealed it, and I put it in the back of my desk drawer." Raymond's hands were shaking. Raymond said, "I was going to give it to Beatrice. The letter says, it says that my father destroyed her father. It says I knew. It says I should have told her before I asked her to marry me." Della said, "Raymond." Raymond said, "I never gave it to her." Della said, "Raymond." Raymond said, "I was a coward. I was a coward when I was 33. I was a coward when I was 40. I was a coward when I was 50. I have been a coward, Della, for 27 years, every day of my life since the day my father told me. Raymond was crying now. Old man tears, slow, heavy, the kind that come up from a place that has been sealed off for a long time. Raymond said, I drove out here today to bring you this letter because I want you to give it to Beatrice. I want her to know everything. I want her to read it in my own handwriting from 1949, with the seal still on it, so she knows I have been carrying this for 27 years, and I did not have the courage to tell her until now. Della said, Raymond, you should give it to her yourself. Raymond said, I can't. Della said, why not? Raymond said, because I am dying. Della went still. Raymond said, the doctor told me last month. I have something in my chest. He cannot fix it. He said I have weeks, maybe 2 months. He said, get my affairs in order. Della said, oh, Raymond. Raymond said, I have not told Beatrice. Della said, Raymond. Raymond said, I will, I promise. I will tell her tonight. But first I had to come out here, to you. Because, Della, I have to tell you something else. Della waited. Raymond said, Henrik told me about the back 5 acres. He told me on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1968. He sat in my office at the dealership and he told me about his experiment and he asked me what I thought. Raymond's voice broke. Raymond said, I laughed at him. Della closed her eyes. Raymond said, I laughed at him, Della, my oldest friend in the world. He was scared. He was hopeful. He was about to do the bravest thing of his life. And I laughed at him. Raymond said, he never brought it up again. 5 months later, he was dead. And I have lived for 7 years knowing that the last private conversation Henrik Crowfield ever had with me, the last real one, I made him feel like a fool. Della opened her eyes. She looked at Raymond. He was 60 years old. He looked 80. He had been carrying this for 7 years. He had been carrying his father's secret for 27 years. He had been carrying his own cowardice for 40. Della understood, looking at him, that she could hate this man. She had every right. She could send him off her porch with the same coldness with which he had laughed at Henrik. She could. She did not. Because Adelaide Crowfield was 67 years old now, and she had learned a thing in the last 4 years, and the thing was this, that the only way out of an old shame was a clean confession to a person who had the power to refuse it. And then the confessor had to live with whatever the person decided. Della reached out. She took the envelope from Raymond's hand. She said, I'll give it to her, Raymond. Tonight. After you tell her about the doctor. Raymond said, thank you. Della said, and Raymond. Raymond said, yes. Della said, Henrik knew you laughed because you were afraid. He told me. In the letter. Raymond's face crumpled. Della said, he wrote, I am afraid Raymond will laugh at me. He knew you would. He went home and he kept doing it anyway. For 5 years. Because he loved his land more than he was afraid of you. Raymond was sobbing now. Quiet. With his shoulders shaking. Della said, he forgave you, Raymond, before he died, in writing. I am telling you this because I think you need to hear it. Raymond said, I don't deserve that. Della said, probably not. She paused. She said, but it's what he gave you anyway. Raymond drove home that afternoon, and he told Beatrice about the doctor. He told her about the letter. He gave her the letter. She read it on the screened porch of their house in Geneva while he sat across from her and watched. When she was done reading, she folded the letter in half. She set it on the wicker table. She said, Raymond, He said, Beatrice. She said, I have known for 24 years. He said, what? She said, your sister told me at a Christmas party. In 1952. I have known the whole time. Raymond stared at her. She stared back. He said, why didn't you say anything? She said, because you didn't. She let that sit. She said, Raymond, I have been waiting 24 years for you to tell me yourself. I would have forgiven you in 1953. I would have forgiven you in 1960. I would have forgiven you in 1970. She picked up the letter. She held it up. She said, I will forgive you now, because you finally found the courage to write it down and give it to me. Raymond made a sound. Beatrice stood up. She walked across the porch. She sat down on his lap, the way she had not sat on his lap in 25 years, and she put her arms around his neck, and she pressed her cheek to his cheek. They stayed like that for a long time. The sun went down. The crickets started. Beatrice whispered something into his ear that nobody else ever heard. Raymond Lindquist died 11 weeks later in his own bed, with his wife holding his hand. In his will, Raymond left the John Deere dealership to Beatrice. He left a separate handwritten note attached to the will. The note said, B. Don't sell another moldboard plow for 5 years. Help Della. Tell every farmer who walks in here to talk to her. Please. Our Beatrice read the note. Beatrice did exactly what it said. For 5 years, the John Deere dealership in Geneva, Iowa, sold no moldboard plows. When customers asked, Beatrice walked them out to the lot, pointed across town, and said, go talk to Adelaide Crowfield. She'll tell you what you actually need. By 1980, 22 farmers in Buchanan County had switched to no-till. By 1985, 49 of 76. The plow was on its way out of the county. It was the quietest revolution Iowa had ever seen. It was led by 2 widows over coffee. Coralie quit her nursing job in Minneapolis in the spring of 1982. She did not tell her mother she was going to do it. She just did it. She sold her house in Minneapolis. She and Donald moved to a small property 4 miles down the road from Della's farm. Donald kept selling insurance. Coralie started raising chickens and growing vegetables and selling them at a farmer's market in Cedar Rapids that her sister Winnie helped her run on weekends. She came over to her mother's house every Sunday for dinner. The first Sunday, she walked in the kitchen door, and she stood in the kitchen, and she said, Mama, I want to apologize. Della said, you already did, sweetheart. On Thanksgiving, in 1972. We're past it. Coralie said, no, Mama, I want to do it again, the right way. Della set down the spoon she was holding. Coralie said, I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong to be afraid. I was wrong to think you were going to fall apart without Daddy. I was wrong to listen to Raymond Lindquist when he came to my house. I was wrong to stop calling you for 3 months in 1972. I was wrong to think the old way was the right way just because Daddy did it. Coralie's voice broke. Coralie said, I lost 3 years with you, Mama. 3 years I will never get back. I am moving home so I can spend the rest of the time we have left close enough to see you every day. Della walked across the kitchen. She put her arms around her oldest daughter. She said, Sweetheart, you didn't lose 3 years. Coralie said, Mama, I did. Della said, no. Sweetheart, you learned something in those 3 years. Coralie said, what did I learn? Della said, that your mother is not as fragile as you thought, which means you don't have to be either. Coralie cried into Della's shoulder. Della held her. The dog, A different dog now. The old one had died in 1979, wagged his tail and watched, the way dogs watch, as if everything happening was entirely normal and exactly what dogs had been hoping for. In the spring of 1991, Della retired. She was 82 years old. Her hands had stopped wanting to do what she told them. Her back had stopped wanting to bend. The cataracts in her left eye were getting bad enough that she could not read seed packets without holding them an inch from her face. She turned the operation over to Winnie. Winnie had been driving up from Cedar Rapids on weekends since 1985 to help. By 1989, she had moved into the farmhouse. By 1990, she had quit the school district. She was 51 years old. She had never married. She had been waiting, in some way Della had not understood at the time, for this exact handoff. Winnie kissed her mother on the forehead the morning of the retirement. Winnie said, "Mama, you're done." Della said, "I'm done." Winnie said, "I'll keep it going." Della said, "I know you will, sweetheart." Winnie said, "And I won't plow." Della said, "Of course you won't." That afternoon, Della walked out to the south field one last time as the woman who ran the place. She walked to the oak tree. She knelt down. She put her hand on the dirt. The dirt was dark. The dirt was crumbly. The dirt was alive. She looked up at the oak. She said, "Henrik, 19 years, same field, no plow. The ground is 6 inches deeper than it was when you died. The wind moved in the oak." She said, "I made it remember, just like you said." She did not cry. She stood up. She walked back to the house. She made tea. She lived another 12 years. She lived to see the corn come in every fall. She lived to see Coralie's chickens win a blue ribbon at the county fair. She lived to see Beatrice every Wednesday for 46 years of Wednesdays. First at one of their kitchens. Later, when Beatrice's hip went bad, at the assisted living place outside town. They drank coffee. They played gin rummy. They held hands. In 1989, when Beatrice was 77 and Della was 80, the two of them flew to California together. It was the first airplane Della had ever been on. It was the first ocean she had ever seen. They sat on the beach at Half Moon Bay. They took off their shoes. They put their feet in the cold Pacific water. Beatrice said, "Adelaide." Della said, "Yes." Beatrice said, "If you had not found that book, I would have died with my father's secret." Della said, "Beatrice." Beatrice said, "You set me free." Della said, "You set me free first. The night you walked in my door with your father's notebook, in April of 1972. Beatrice said, "I almost didn't come." Della said, "I know." Beatrice said, "I sat on the bed for 9 hours. I almost stayed home." Della said, "I'm so glad you didn't be." Beatrice said, "Me too." They sat in the sand for a long time. They watched the sun go down over the Pacific. Two women in their 70s and 80s who had each carried things that had cost them everything to carry, who had each found someone they could finally set the things down beside. It was the best week of Della's life. She told Beatrice so. Beatrice cried into a paper napkin. They flew home on a Tuesday. She died in her own bed on a Sunday morning in May of 2003. She was 94. Coralie had been with her the night before. Winnie had been there in the morning. The hospice nurse had said it would be sometime that day. Della had asked Winnie to bring her 3 things: the Bible, the 50-cent book, the leather notebook she had found in the cedar trunk in October of 1972. Winnie set all 3 on the bed beside her. Della closed her eyes. She said, "Henrik, Winnie said. Mama. Della said, I can hear him. Winnie said, What's he saying, Mama? Della said, He's saying, Come on, Della, we've got work to do. Della smiled. She did not open her eyes again. She was gone in a few minutes. Winnie sat beside the bed and held her hand and did not let go for a long time. The funeral was held on a Saturday, the 3rd week of May, at the small Lutheran church in Geneva. The church seated 140. 312 people came. They came from Buchanan County. They came from Mahaska County. They came from across the river. A man drove up from Christian County, Kentucky, with a sealed envelope from his father, a man named Harlan Pickett, who had himself died the year before, who had wanted Della Crowfield to know, before either of them was gone, that her work in Iowa had not gone unseen by the man whose own work she had read about in the library all those Saturdays. The envelope contained a single sentence. She finished what I started. She finished what we both started. With deepest gratitude. H. Pickett. Winnie read it from the pulpit. She did not cry while she read it. She had cried already. Beatrice Lindquist came to the funeral in a wheelchair. She was 91 years old. She had broken her hip the year before. She had not been to a funeral in 2 years because she did not have the strength. She came to this one. She wheeled herself slowly up to the open grave at the cemetery after the service, after most of the mourners had drifted away. Her grandson pushed the wheelchair the last few feet through the soft grass. There was a small wooden box on the seat of the wheelchair next to her. Beatrice opened the box. Inside the box was a glass mason jar. Inside the mason jar was about a cup of dirt. Dark dirt. Crumbly dirt. Dirt with a small live earthworm visible against the inside of the glass. Della had given it to her in February. Della had said, B, when I go, take this and put it in the grave. So I take some of the field with me. Beatrice had said, Adelaide. Della had said, promise me. Beatrice had promised. Beatrice unscrewed the lid of the jar now. Her hands were shaking, but she was not crying. She had decided in the parking lot that morning that she was not going to cry. Adelaide had not liked it when people made a fuss. Beatrice tipped the jar. The dirt fell into the open grave. It landed on the wood of the casket lid with a soft sound. The earthworm tumbled out with it. Beatrice watched the earthworm wriggle once on the casket and then disappear into the loose soil at the bottom of the grave. Beatrice said, out loud, in a clear voice, loud enough that the few people still standing nearby heard her, Adelaide, the ground will remember you. She paused. She said, thank you for teaching an old woman that it is never too late to be brave. Then her grandson turned the wheelchair around and pushed her slowly back across the grass to the car. The Crowfield farm is still no-till. Coralie ran her market garden until 2009. Winnie ran the corn operation until 2012, when her own niece, Coralie's daughter, Sarah, took it over. Sarah is 41 years old as of this telling. She has 2 kids. She has a degree in soil science from Iowa State. She is the 3rd generation of Crowfield women to work that ground without a plow. The organic matter in the soil, last tested, is at 5.7%. Earthworms per cubic foot, 72. Yields, consistent with or above the county average, every year for 48 years running. The 50-cent book sits on a shelf in the kitchen, next to the cookbooks. It still has Earl Haberman's name written inside the front cover. It still has the soft creases where Henrik Crowfield's letter sat for over 3 years before Della Crowfield found it. The letter is in a frame on the kitchen wall. Sarah's children pass it every morning on their way to the school bus. Sarah read it to them, the first time, when each of them turned 10. She said, "This is the letter your great-grandfather wrote your great-grandmother 12 days before he died. This is the letter that taught her she was allowed to do what was right." Then she said, "And this is the letter that is going to teach you the same thing." There is a bench under the oak tree at the edge of the south field. Sarah's husband built it in 2014. A small brass plaque is screwed into the back of the bench. The plaque reads, Adelaide Crowfield, 1909 to 2003. She listened to the soil. The soil listened back. Beatrice Lindquist died in her sleep, peacefully, in November of 2003, 6 months and 11 days after her best friend. She was 91. She left specific instructions in her will for what was to be done with her ashes. Her ashes were scattered by her grandson on a quiet Sunday morning in the spring of 2004 in Adelaide Crowfield's south field, right beside the oak tree, right where the bench is now. So the two old widows could sit, the way they had sat for so many years across so many kitchen tables, together, forever, in the only ground in Buchanan County that had ever truly known either of them. End.